Let's begin by looking at what's going on to the west of Bakhmut, specifically around Ivanivske. And we can now say that the village is contested with the Russian forces attacking from several axes. And one of such axes is actually new that we haven't discussed yet. We're going to begin by looking at the Russian attack from the north. As we talked about in previous videos, the Russian forces have utilized their newly acquired positions around the Pobjeda cemetery and the tree lines and forested areas to the south, and these are located on heights that are giving the Russians a good position for fire support as their VDV units from the 98th Division continue advancing southwards. And so there has been a concerted effort to occupy additional Ukrainian defenses and additional fields in no man's land directly to the north of Ivanivske. And so a lot of the Ukrainian positions in Ivanivske that are located within valleys are being fired upon from the north, which is creating a very difficult situation for the defenders. But on top of that, you do have a concerted effort to put pressure and breach the Ukrainian lines from the northeast. This is one of the main vectors of attack, where you had elements of Russia's 102nd Motorized Regiment launching a new attack, and they were able to take over several of Ukraine's hastily prepared defenses to the northeast of Ivanivske, overrun them. A lot of them were built in the ditches in those valleys. And since then, the Russian forces from that regiment have taken over some of the first residential blocks within Ivanivske, including this road over here. And so there are now battles going on in these residential sections. Also, you have battles going on along the highway. And so you had Russian forces advancing in BMP-3s, utilizing the fire support from those vehicles to dislodge Ukrainian strongholds located within the tree lines that run parallel to the highway. And so you do have examples of Russia doing that specifically along these two tree lines. And that has allowed the Russian forces to clear out the resistance on the outskirts of the village and now focus directly on it while flanking it from two directions. And at the same time, they are launching armored assaults to the southeast of Ivanivske, as was confirmed by a video from Ukraine's Signum unit, which is a drone group that is affiliated with the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, a Ukrainian unit that's also generally operating on the Bakhmut front. And so that footage I have marked over here, they launched some strikes utilizing FPVs on at least 6 different Russian vehicles, causing direct hits. And that occurred both on the highway and also in the fields directly to the southeast in this vector of attack over here, where the Russian forces are utilizing dirt roads. The reason why they're advancing in this area is to first off take over Ukraine's southern flank to Ivanivske, so it will be enveloped on 3 sides. But this position is also important because it includes many of Ukraine's fortifications. See, when the Russian forces were advancing in this direction last year during their Bakhmut offensive, they were attacking Ivanivske directly from the south, and so a lot of Ukraine's prepared defenses were built directly in this direction. And so they didn't really prepare defenses to the north or to the east as much. And so now the Russian forces are flanking those defenses that were built to the south from the east. And at the same time, they're trying to take over the Ukrainian positions that are located on heights. Because you see the positions in those fields to the south of Ivanivske are on a local height that is overlooking the valley on which Ivanivske and the T-0504 road leading into Ivanivske are located on. And so now you have the first Russian actual effort in that direction. At the same time, we're seeing the Russians make use of their positions around Pobjeda to advance further north. And so there was a new video released today by the Russian side. I have it marked with a geolocated marker over here. Actually, what you see is a Russian armored assault from the 98th Division, which started off in the cemetery and then goes further north along this road, dislodging pretty large Russian infantry squads that then get out and begin clearing the Ukrainian trench, which was set up in this position to hold the southern flank of Avdiivka, but they were unable to rely on necessary artillery support. And so for that reason, and also due to the Russian pressure, they were pushed out. And so the Russian forces were able to occupy this key fortification and these additional positions located in rail lines several hundred meters to the south of Avdiivka. This was further confirmed by a video from the Sarmat battalion of the 56th Motorized Brigade, which is a unit that's also operating around Avdiivka, but it now has some of its elements in the Bakhmut front. And so they have drones dropping grenades onto the Russian positions that they just took over south of Avdiivka. Now moving on to the Avdiivka front, we're going to unpack the recent Russian advances to the west of the city. And so these really shouldn't come as a surprise for several reasons. First of all, even though the Russian forces have started rotating out some of their forces from the Avdiivka direction, remember that they have around 40 to 50,000 soldiers that were not involved in the battle necessarily, but that were stationed on the front line, on the rear, or generally around the city of Donetsk that could be rotated in whenever needed. Some of those forces are now surplus to requirements and could be moved elsewhere. Ukrainian sources have reported some being moved to the southern direction, which could be southern Donetsk or Zaporozhia, and others being moved to the Kupiansk fronts. And a lot of that is because now the front line has shortened. You don't have a cauldron, which is running through the perimeter of the city, which stretches like 30 kilometers. You have a solid 12-kilometer line that is being pushed through that requires much less forces for rotation. But nonetheless, still, you do have a sizable Russian garrison that is remaining and is continuing to push. In fact, they've recently intensified their pushes to the west of the city. And as I said before, this shouldn't come as a surprise for several reasons. The Russian forces don't want to wait and give the Ukrainians time to build up a second line of defense that is being, or at least in theory, would have been built along this line of towns to the west of Avdiivka that were previously supplying it, which go through Berdichi, Semenivka, all the way to Severne. They don't want to give the Ukrainians time to build up their forces and get over the fatigue that they're currently experiencing. Because if you remember, just a week ago, these Ukrainian forces were involved in several kilometers of withdrawals, most of them on foot, sometimes in very small groups on their own. And so you did see a lot of withdrawals of Ukrainian forces. They were involved in an operation that was extremely difficult, led to high casualties, injuries, and did destroy a lot of cohesion within smaller units. And so in the time since that, they've had to sort of pick up the pieces and try to reorganize in time for the next Russian assaults. And so they're not in the best state for defensive operations. And when you go through the Ukrainian unit composition in this region, it's filled with units that have been at the front line for several months now, if not more, if not for years. And so really the only silver lining is that Azov was recently moved in, and so they haven't had the same levels of attrition. They only moved in at the end, and nonetheless, when they were fighting, they did have high casualties on a daily basis, but they do still have most of their combat capabilities preserved, which does mean we'll see a lot of them in the coming months in the sector. But in any case, these issues that I just listed are further compounded by the lack of Ukrainian artillery supports, as was reported by a lot of Ukrainian sources on the sector. They have a disadvantage of 10 to 1. The Russians are outfiring them by 10 times in terms of artillery shelling in this section of the front line. Not on the front line in general, but specifically in this battle. They do not have the proper artillery to fire back. They don't have counter battery fire that can accurately target the Russian groupings that are firing artillery from the Donetsk area. And that allows the Russian forces to not just use artillery, but also in general, they're utilizing much more firepower from a closer range. And when you look at their air force, we've recently seen videos of Russian air sorties flying above Avdiivka in the direction of villages like Severne and conducting a lot of their Fab 500 attacks from actually closer range now towards some of the Ukrainian targets. And so we've seen the Russians intensify their air bombardment of withdrawing Ukrainian forces. And to further make issues worse, there is an elevation disadvantage for the Ukrainians. Right now, the Russians are in control of Avdiivka. Avdiivka is not really on that high of an elevation. So despite that fact, when you compare the positions that Russia has in Avdiivka, including the center of the city and the residential areas, to the current Ukrainian positions in fields and small villages to the west, the Russians do still have a notable height advantage in terms of where their forces are positioned. And of course, I didn't even mention the coke plant in the 9th district, which give Russia a massive height advantage. So for instance, the coke plants are located over here. It is sort of this northeastern bulge in Avdiivka, or northwestern bulge, that it sort of protrudes into the Ukrainian defense line, gives the Russians a very good field of vision to look towards the Ukrainian forces as they mount the defense, as they move forces around. And that could give them a field of vision that goes several kilometers in all directions, including Stepove, Berdichi, Semenivka, and of course Orlivka. And so the Russians are utilizing that. Of course, they're also utilizing positions in the high-rise apartment buildings in the 9th district to look towards an area like Severne or Letstochkine in particular. And that leads us to the topic of today's video, which is these Russian advances that have occurred recently. And so we started receiving reports first about Severne around the 21st of February. At the time, the reports weren't confirmed, but they were claiming that there were two Russian axes for their attack on Severne, one directly from the east along this dirt road that starts in the 9th district, and that the Russian forces were able to occupy positions in these residential areas directly to the north of the small stream that's running from Tonenke into northeastern Severne. So that's one attack. And the second attack came from Vodiane and occupied some of the southeastern parts of Severne. And so that is the confirmed reports, as was verified later on by Deep State, I believe, on the 23rd of February. And at this point, it's extremely likely that the Ukrainians have withdrawn all of their forces from Severne towards Tonenke. That's what Russian sources were claiming. They claim that all of the village is under Russian control, but there is still some ambiguity because Ukrainian sources have not yet verified this information. And so for now, I'm going to just leave the rest of the village as a gray zone. But it is extremely likely that the Russian forces did advance in this direction. And what this means is that the Ukrainian garrison that's marked in this area in blue, meaning the Ukrainian forward squads that are located near the Russian line of contact to the north of Vodiane, they're going to be in danger because they no longer have this artery of Severne to connect to during their operations. And so they're now sort of cut off and forced to withdraw northwards towards Tonenke. And so by virtue of the Russians advancing in Severne, they have reduced some of the pressure that they previously had on a village like Vodiane on the front line. But in any case, you have the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian infantry squads, which, if you asked me, they're probably from the 53rd Mechanized Brigade that were previously stationed in Severne, being moved further north of Tonenke. The Russian forces, of course, spotted the retreating Ukrainian units and dropped Fab 500 and Fab 1500 bombs on their positions, as was marked in this video. And these bombs were also dropped on Ukrainian forces that were withdrawing from the village of Vostochkine along these roads over here towards the village of Avdiivka. And so that leads us to the next village that we do know for sure the Russians captured, and that's Vostochkine. Vostochkine was, of course, an inevitable target for the Russians. Even before Avdiivka fell, the Russians were already preparing an armored attack in the direction of the village. And so the Ukrainians had to move in fatigued soldiers to hold the line over there from a territorial defense unit marked over here. The first assault that was launched by the Russians, they were able to repel, and that occurred around the 21st of February. They were able to hold back several Russian armored vehicles in that assault along the dirt road. But that was just the first foray. And in the time since then, the past 3 days, the Russian forces have launched a second wave with a higher intensity. And this time, the Ukrainian forces were simply unable to hold the line after being so treated not just in Avdiivka, but also around Vostochkine. And they were forced to withdraw towards Orlivka itself. And so the Russian attack started off by getting control of the eastern outskirts by the 21st, and then they gradually pushed through, took over the eastern section of the village by the 23rd, which was yesterday. And today it was fully confirmed that the Ukrainians withdrew from the village. This was again reported by Deep States, and we have a video of the Russians raising the flag in the eastern part of the village. This village in particular is extremely hard to defend given how low in elevation it is, given the fact that it is relatively cut off from the rest of the Ukrainian defensive nodes in an area like Orlivka, for instance, and because of its close proximity to the Russian coke plants where they were definitely being fired upon. And so that helped the 35th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade in its operations as it took over the village. And the Ukrainians, despite all these disadvantages, they did try their best to hold on for the past week, simply in order to buy time for the rest of the Ukrainian forces to retreat towards Orlivka and to try to prepare some sort of hastily made defenses in time for the Russian forces to arrive in that village, because now that they have Vostochkine, they have unlocked 3 new routes by which to attack that village that you can see marked over here on the map, in addition to the route that they've already started using, which is a dirt road from the coke plant directly. The last village we'll look at is Pobjeda, because there is some ambiguity about the situation. What we do know for sure is that the Ukrainians have fully left the village in favor of holding positions around Berdichi. This is because the Russians now have control of the coke plants, and it's simply too close to Pobjeda, and it's being fired upon heavily. And so now it's only a matter of when the Russian forces will decide to go into the rest of the village and begin clearing out the basements and the dugouts in the region to make it their new forward attacking node before they attack Berdichi directly. And so the Ukrainians, they try their best to hold out and buy time for Berdichi specifically. And so that's when we begin seeing videos from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, including using their tank battalions that now include them when Abrams. And so they released a video showing their Abrams conducting a operation near the front line, specifically along this road that's marked in the red arrow, where they sent their tank towards the line of contact around Stepove to fire towards the Russian forces that are located in the eastern portion of the village, trying to hit their specific firing points. And remember, this is also the same region where the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade recorded the destruction of the M1150 assault breacher vehicle based on the chassis of the Abrams. And so again, this rapid deployment, because we didn't see this before for several months, but now this sudden deployment of this tank to the front line on the northern flank of the Avdiivka sector does indicate the Ukrainians' willingness to utilize some expensive and rather rare systems at their disposal that they're now using in order to prevent a wider collapse of the front line on this northern part of their new defensive fortification. And I do believe a lot of that has to do with them trying to prevent the Russians from reaching the village of Ocheretina. And I think this is also a part of Ukraine's broader plan for when they eventually lose control over these villages to the west of Avdiivka, which is now happening at a pretty fast pace. And so the Ukrainians do definitely have to put an emphasis on creating a new defense line that could be more stable going forward. And so if that were to be the case, I do think that Ocheretina would be a massive part of this Ukrainian defense, because Ocheretina, first of all, it's a major local hub of logistics where a lot of roads split out from that connect to different parts of the Ukrainian line, but also it's located on the largest height in the region for the Ukrainians. And that ridge that they have under their control, the Ukrainians, expands further south. And so the Ukrainians could utilize those high grounds in those fields that are located generally in this red perimeter to construct their new line of defense that would have to go all the way down to the valleys on which Umanske are located and directly south towards Netelove. And by doing so, they would have a defense line that is also able to prevent further Russian attacks once they're able to get control over Prvomaiske, which is currently being attacked from two specific directions, which does raise questions about how close the Russians will be to Netelove. And so it is also important that the Russian or the Ukrainian defense line does incorporate that into their accounting. So as you can see, here's the elevation map, and as you can understand, you see why I said that Avdiivka, and not just Avdiivka, but also the Russian positions to the east of it, located in a ridge to the north of the city of Donetsk, are located on high ground overlooking the valley on which the Ukrainians are currently defending. But then you could also see the rear, where the Ukrainians have as a potential backup line. And that includes Cheretina, which again, as you can see in the specific region, is the largest height in that specific region. And not only does Cheretina have this defensive capability, it also does present a defensive capability for the Russians when, or if they were able to capture that section. It would be able to give them access to certain roads that would branch out to the north and to the west that would allow them to penetrate deep into Ukraine's rear in this part of the Donetsk front. And so it is an imperative for the Ukrainians that if they haven't already, to start building defensive fortifications all along the flanks of that village of Cheretina, but also expand them southwards in order to prevent the Russians from taking advantage of the fields that are located to the west of an area like Orlivka to penetrate the Ukrainian line and create gaps as they're currently doing in the defense line marked in this blue rectangle. And quickly before we move on to Robotyne, it is important to mention that yesterday, the 23rd of February, Deep State did report there was a Ukrainian counterattack, probably organized by the 33rd Mechanized Brigade and 95th Air Assault Brigade, to retake Pobjeda. According to Deep State, now the southern part of the village is considered a gray zone, generally marked along this line in red. So we're going to have to wait and see for future confirmation of this. But I'm not surprised, given the importance of Pobjeda on a local level, that the Ukrainian infantry squads in the region would try to organize an attack despite the potential casualties that they could have in store, because the 33rd Mechanized Brigade in particular does have a large armored component with Leopards that could be used in such assaults. So we'll have to wait and see about that. Now, on the Orikhiv sector, the Russian forces have been able to advance over the past day, and the most The most interesting advance, the largest one that we see on the map, is in southern Robotyne, and this comes after really months of Russian pressure in the sector, you could say. But the pressure itself wasn't that large in comparison to other parts of the front line. But really, starting about last week, that's when we saw the Russian forces take it up a notch, launching not just a high amount of artillery output, but also armored assaults in various directions. And that includes assaults that were going on, in particular, to the west of Robotyne, utilizing that western flank to put significant pressure onto the Ukrainian garrison located in the village and located in the roads that are leading into it. And so, of course, in the initial assaults, as is to be expected when the Ukrainians are mounting a defense of the line of contact, those assaults were repelled. And that included capabilities of the Ukrainians using drones, artillery, and landmines to prevent the Russian armored assaults. And again, those assaults were going on directly to the northwest of Robotyne in order to secure the flank, and directly to the west of Robotyne in order to create an attack vector that could be used to penetrate the village. And so all those assaults were going on, and for several days the Ukrainians were able to hold on to the front line. But after a certain period in time, the pressure was just too large, and the Ukrainians simply do not have the firepower to compete with the Russians. And so eventually the Ukrainians were left with no other option but to withdraw. And sometimes they couldn't even withdraw in time. It was actually the Russian forces that initiated the assaults and pushed back the Ukrainians. And really the best example of this is from a video that I have geolocated on my map, which shows the 78th Motor Rifle Regiment sending BMP-3s into the center of Robotyne along this specific route, which is marked over here in this red vector. And the only reason why the Russians were able to do this is because of those initial assaults that occurred a week ago that did end up, you could say, in failure because the Ukrainians were able to repel them. But at the same time, it did attrit the Ukrainian side, and the Ukrainian side, in general, when they attrit forces, that takes a much larger blow to them, even if in absolute terms they don't lose as many forces. In relative terms, it is still something very significant for their defenders in the region. And so eventually they degraded the Ukrainians to such a level that the Russian forces were able to establish control over the road, over the fortifications that are surrounding Robotyne. And this time around, when the Russian forces were launching an armored attack, they actually didn't even suffer armored losses. They were able to make it directly into the center of Robotyne, something that would have been unimaginable several months ago if the Russians had attempted that. And that really does show the degradation of the Ukrainian garrison in this region, that they couldn't call in artillery support. They couldn't even send FPV drones in this particular case to target the BMP-3s, as we can see in the video marked in the description over here. They were able to send in several BMP-3s into the center of this Ukrainian node, which is supposed to be highly fortified, as the Ukrainians have held on to it for many months now, specifically by this brigade, 65th Mechanized Brigade. And what we see in the video is that the Russians were able to dismount large infantry squads. Before, we were seeing the Russians dropping off very small numbers in the sector, 4 or 5, something like that. Now in these videos, we're seeing like 10 infantrymen being dropped off from the same vehicle. So it shows the Russians are more confident now to be able to do such things, not just in open fields or trying to overrun a trench, but directly within a populated area with buildings around that could be used as firing positions. But what we do see in the video is that there were not many Ukrainian firing positions to target the Russian forces in the center of the village. I believe in the video you could see some RPG fire targeting the Russian vehicles, but that's about it. And in the end, the Russian forces that were dismounted were able to occupy about half of Robotyne, including the post office marked over here. And so the Ukrainian forces were forced to withdraw to the northern outskirts of the village. But in reality, the main Ukrainian garrison in the region, they're not actually staying within the village itself, just because it is so pummeled, so just because the Russian forces have been firing into it so much and onto the highway leading into it. So what you do have is the Ukrainians usually located in small dugouts located on the perimeter of the village, or located in the Russian-built trench system directly to the east of it. And then in the morning, when they engage with the Russian forces, they move directly into the town itself. And so now with the Russians displaying that they are able to break through even areas that would be considered previously to be very fortified using their armored columns, it's going to raise a lot of questions about what the Ukrainians are doing in some of these pockets that have formed in the areas directly to the east of Robotyne. In all likelihood, the Ukrainians are evacuating these regions in order to preserve manpower. And so you can see, for instance, in these fields located over here. A lot of them consist of Russian-built trenches that were then taken over by the Ukrainians and utilized over this winter period to defend against the Russian attacks. And now, because of the precarious situation of the Ukrainian forces, which includes being flanked from the west now, because the Russian forces have control of half of Robotyne, they're going to have to evacuate these areas further north. They're going to have to go to these positions that are located in these forested areas directly to the northeast of Robotyne. And this brings back a lot of deja vu, because these positions are the same ones that the Ukrainians fought over at the beginning of the summer counteroffensive. Remember, the Ukrainians, they really fought with the blood of thousands of men who were either killed or injured in these battles that were monumental in taking over the villages of Robotyne and the surrounding fortifications. But in the end, those same advances are now being reversed by the Russian forces, with much less pushback than the Russian forces were putting up at the time when the Ukrainians were assaulting them. Here's this quick sketch I made of the elevation on the Orikhiv sector. What you can see is that primarily the Russians are occupying the heights, while the Ukrainians in fields or otherwise in supply lines leading into Robotyne are located in valleys. So you can see that marked over here. Here are the trenches the Russians built that the Ukrainians control in the fields. Here is the northern part of Robotyne, which is also located on a rather low elevation. And as you can see, the Russian forces, particularly on the western flank of Robotyne, do have control of a ridge. And now that Robotyne is being taken over, that ridge is also going to be important in overlooking the Ukrainian positions located in the areas around Orikhiv. Now, physical attack on Orikhiv is extremely unrealistic at the moment, because the Russian forces simply have not indicated that they are allocating the necessary resources to do so. But for the time being, the Russian forces could certainly get closer to the village and utilize their high points to fire upon it to further retreat the Ukrainian garrison located in that city. And so that would include taking over control of the ridges that Ukraine does still have under their control, which includes ridges to the north of Nestyryanka, around Robotyne, and also to the northwest of Verbove. And so I think we'll see a lot of that in the near future, with the Russians continuing their operations in the sector. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.